Okay, so we have covered federal regulation through the executive branch. Let's turn to the legislative branch. They're also obviously very active here. So, Congress has today incredibly broad authority to pass legislation that affects basically every facet of our lives. Let's take a look at where they get that power. You probably know what I'm going to say. It all starts with the Constitution. So, Article 1 of the Constitution really sets out the structure and the authority of Congress to pass laws, to legislate. And we've talked about there are enumerated powers. You see an artistic description of the enumerated powers that are very specific powers given to Congress to regulate. And Congress can only do things that the Constitution says they can do. So, for example, they have the power to coin and create money, right? They have the ability to print money. That's specifically mentioned in the Constitution. The power to issue patents is also specifically mentioned in the Constitution. The power to tax and spend, the power to declare war and raise a military. These are very specific powers that are given to Congress. But they also included some language that has been interpreted incredibly broadly, that has expanded the scope of Congress's authority over the last 200 years, since the founding of our country. So while perhaps the intent, there's a lot of argument here. Some people argue that these broad phrases were included to give flexibility, to give Congress more power, and some people argue the opposite, that these powers are very specifically written for a reason. But nonetheless, we have these phrases that were included in the enumeration of powers that have now been interpreted incredibly broadly that allow Congress to act in a lot of areas. So one example of this is the Commerce Clause, the ability to regulate interstate commerce. That's where Congress has authority. Interstate commerce, anything that stays 100% wholly within the state, that's for the state to regulate. But if it goes in between the states, that's Congress's territory. So this is one of the most powerful tools that Congress has because it has been interpreted very broadly. So some examples we have here of legislation that was passed under this Commerce Clause. So the very famous Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibited private entities, private citizens from discriminating against people on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin in public accommodations and in employment. This was upheld by the Supreme Court. This was challenged, that this was too far. Congress had gone too far. Nothing said that they could regulate discrimination. But the Supreme Court found that interstate movement in between people of color, specifically African Americans in the South, was impeded and was affected because they couldn't get public accommodations. They couldn't get hotels, so they couldn't travel. So this was affecting interstate travel, the Supreme Court found. So Congress was allowed to pass this legislation. There's another case, I talked about it earlier. I call it the Wheat case, but its proper name is Wickard v. Filburn, and I think every law student learns about this case. This was in the 1940s, and the Agricultural Adjustment Act was in play. It's an act passed by Congress that regulated how much wheat could be grown. So it was placing some limitations on different agricultural products, including wheat. And this private citizen was growing wheat in his own private property for his own private consumption. But it was more than what was allowed by this federal law. And so it was litigated all the way up to the Supreme Court, which ruled that even personal intrastate agricultural activities have a could be regulated because they have a cumulative effect. If everyone does this, it's going to have an effect on the wheat industry across state borders. So even though there's no commerce, and even though it's not interstate, it was found to be interstate commerce by the Supreme Court. And this is one of those cases where, okay, if we're going to allow this, like, just let Congress, regulate everywhere. They are still subject to limitations, but you can imagine with Wickard v. Filburn that it was a really broad about as broad as you can possibly get of an interpretation of interstate commerce. So since then, since 1942, we've seen Congress legislate in a lot of areas that no one probably predicted at the founding of the country when they were writing those enumerated powers. Another example of this is the Clean Air Act that was passed in 1970 that created the Environmental Protection Agency because pollution in the air can travel, so that's interstate commerce. So it allowed Congress to act in the area of environmental protection. So the Commerce Clause is an incredibly powerful phrase for the powers of congressional legislation. The power to tax and spend, that is one of these very specific enumerated powers in Article 1 of the Constitution. And this is where Congress draws a lot of their authority. So Congress has the power to tax, and Congress has the authority to decide how the money they've raised can be spent. So they set the budget. Right now, you're probably hearing a lot about the budget because Congress needs to pass a new one to keep government functioning. But by controlling federal tax and spending, Congress can really influence in a lot of areas where they could not directly legislate. From social welfare to some to defense, things like that. They can use their money, they can put strings on it to incentivize states that they otherwise can't control to act in certain ways. I'll give you a really famous example. Pretty much every state today in the United States has a minimum drinking age of 21 years. But this was not always the case. The state of Louisiana, for many years, kept their drinking age at 18. Now, Congress wanted them to change this, but Congress didn't have the power to legislate in this area. So instead, what they did is they tied federal highway funding to the minimum age of drinking. So if your minimum age of drinking was not 21, you are not going to participate in the federal highway funding. And if I remember correctly, I believe Louisiana held out for a little bit, and their roads became known to be very, very, very bad because they were lacking the federal funds to keep them up. But eventually they gave in and they raised their minimum drinking age to 21 so they could, again, access the federal funds for highway improvements. So that's an example of federal government or of Congress using their tax and spend power, which is allowed, but to get results that they otherwise couldn't exactly legislate. Another example of tax and spend being used pretty broadly is the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare. This was considered pretty controversial when it happened because of its use of tax and spend. But the Affordable Care Act requires citizens in the United States to have health insurance. It also sets up a public health exchange in which people can purchase affordable health insurance, but there is a requirement that you have health insurance, and you can be penalized if you don't have it. And the penalty is a tax penalty. So Congress was using its power of tax to pass an Affordable Care Act, to require that people get health insurance, and also to set up the healthcare exchange so that people could buy affordable healthcare. So that was considered a really novel and controversial use. It went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said that's a valid use of the tax and spend power. Another place where Congress really draws its power is this sort of catch-all that's at the end of the enumerated powers. So the Article 1 of the Constitution lists out all the things that Congress can do, and at the end they kind of give them this nice little bow to wrap it all up, called the Necessary and Proper Clause. They said Congress can do these enumerated things, and then anything necessary and proper to accomplish those things. And that, had, of course, as you can imagine, has been implemented and interpreted incredibly broadly. In fact, this is called the elastic clause because you can stretch it so far. So this first, they got to work right away on using this necessary and proper clause, almost over 200 years ago, in the early 1800s. The United States federal government decided it was going to make a national bank. Now, the enumerated powers don't say anything about creating a national bank, but it does say that Congress can print and coin money, and that they can tax and regulate commerce. And so it was necessary and proper to create a bank to assist with these enumerated powers. So that was the first big showdown between the people that think Congress should be limited, and that these powers should be thought of very conservatively, and the people that think they should be interpreted very broadly. So even way back in the early 1800s, Congress was already starting to rule in Congress's favor. The creation of the Drug Enforcement Agency is another example of using the necessary and proper clause. Congress regulates controlled substances, including illicit substances like drugs, and so because they can control the manufacture or prohibit the manufacture and use of these controlled substances, which cross state lines, it is necessary and proper to create an agency that enforces compliance with these rules. So Congress's powers, although we say they're enumerated, they're limited, they're pretty broad this day and age.